Welcome to the Abbey Mill Business Centre for this small conference on the thread linen history, or linen thread industry of the Renfrewshire. Just before we start, my name's George Walker. I'm the Secretary of the Paisley Philosophical Institution, and we'd just like to give a very quick overview of the institution. We were formed in 1808, still going. We deliver a series of lectures on various topics throughout the winter months. At the moment, we have been in abeyance for a year or two due to the COVID epidemic, but we are starting up a combination of live and Zoom talks starting shortly. I'm hoping to put some details of that out in the next couple of days. If anybody is interested in joining us, we will put contact details on the link to the review. In terms of the talks cover a wide variety of subjects on the arts, the sciences, basically anything that people would like to be are interested in. They are not aimed at an academic audience, they are aimed at a general audience. So please don't feel threatened by the name. We are actually quite a nice wee organisation and would like to see more people come and enjoy our talks. So I don't want to waste too much time because you're not really here to listen to me. We will be having two speakers this afternoon. The first will be Stephen Clancy, who's known as the urban historian, who's co-presenter of this event, and also Lucy McConnell, who's a dress historian. I'll give you a wee bit more detail as we come in. But before we start, could I ask Provost of Renfrewshire, Lorraine to give a wee welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think perhaps you should just lock the door and don't let anyone out until they all sign up to the institution. That would be a good idea. Thank you for asking me along here today, and I'm really very glad to be here. I think given the circumstances of the last few days and the very sad death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, I think most people that know me know I'm not a royalist, but I've had a very, very soft spot for the Queen. She was a mother and a grandmother and a sister and all that goes on, the same as every one of us. And I think she will be a sad loss. There was a time when we thought maybe we couldn't go ahead with this, but thankfully we've decided to go ahead. I have been advised by officers in the council to try and keep it as non-celebratory and short as I can, so that is what I'll do today. But that brings me round to just welcoming every one of you here, and I don't know whether you're all from Paisley or not, but if you're from Paisley, hello. I know some of you. It's nice to see you again, and if you aren't, welcome to this beautiful, beautiful town. And those of us who live here and who are frequent visitors to Paisley know it's a wonderful, special place. Paisley is vibrant, it's on the way up, it's bold, it's radical. Its people are quite radical, a bit more so than other towns, I have to say. And it's full of history and culture, and we just need to get out and about there and see what's there for ourselves. We have a lot of going on in the town right now. We have our civic buildings that are being renovated. Hopefully the town hall part of it will be open before the end of the year, with a full opening by Easter or spring next year. It's all very exciting, and I wish you could all see what I have seen. I think it's going to be absolutely wonderful. It's going to be a new town hall for a new generation, a new era, while trying to retain the same sort of, obviously the same sort of look, just modernised, creating more rooms. It'll be more accessible to the public, and of course the museum is going to be wonderful too. So I think that having this here, this linen thread anniversary, the 300th anniversary of the introduction of fine linen thread making in Paisley, is very, very special. I wish more people could have been coming along today, but we are where we are. This is so important to us because we are going to try using or placing the emphasis on our culture and our history in order to attract more tourists. And this is integral. This here is what's going to do that. It's about using it properly. It's about creating the infrastructure to make sure that people can come along and find places easily and hopefully at low cost or no cost. That's all going on behind the scenes just now. And hopefully when the civic buildings open up again, it will become a vibrant town once again. I think it's already vibrant. You just need to go to the right places. You just need to speak to the right people. And Doors Open Day is a great opportunity to get around and see all of the places that perhaps you haven't thought of going before. That's wonderful. And I think Doors Open Day is coming up quite soon. But getting back to our history and culture, we know in Paisley that we are known throughout the world. We are known throughout the world for the Paisley pattern. Whether or not you agree that we invented it or not, I say we did. Lots of people dispute that. The Paisley pattern, our beautiful shawls, our thread, our cotton, our name was put on the map because it went worldwide. People went abroad, the Coates family, the Clark's family, they set up businesses abroad. And that also gave the townspeople an opportunity, or some of them, an opportunity to go abroad and learn about different cultures and teach the people of that town or that city how to do the job, basically. So it was very good for our townsfolk. Those companies were very, very good to their employees. And Paisley was once a really, really vibrant and affluent place. I want us to get back to that again. So I'll be doing everything I can during my next term as Provost to make sure that that happens. Doesn't matter whether that's travel and tourism or manufacturing, industry, research. We've already put steps in place to try to create opportunities for local people and people from outside to come here and settle, to know that Renfrewshire and Paisley is the place to be. So I think without further ado, I'm just going to say to you that it's been a pleasure getting to welcome you here today and to officially open the conference. And if you don't mind, I am going to sneak off a bit early because with the death of the Queen, my diary has changed quite significantly. So I have things to do later on. And I just hope you all enjoy the conference and it all goes well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Cameron. To echo what the Provost said about the culture in Paisley and about the museum, one of the major things that the institution has over the years was it was the major contributor of the exhibits that made up the initial museum, as well as helping establish, and it was in fact a meeting of the Paisley Philosophical Institution that came up with the idea of having a library and museum in the town. So we are part of the culture of this wonderful town. We want to continue to see what we can do to help assist in keeping that culture alive. So thank you again, Provost Cameron. Now to go on to the actual subjects of the meeting. We have, unfortunately, John Ennis, who was supposed to be speaking, is indisposed and is unable to join us. So we are down, we have only the two speakers, but both Stephen and Lucy have tried to extend their talks a wee bit just to give us a wee bit more. And also Lucy has kindly brought along a lot of stuff from her collection in the swatch shots, which you'll get a chance to look at later. But first of all, I'm going to introduce Stephen Clancy to you. Stephen is known as the urban historian. He is a native of Paisley who leads a lot of history tours. He does genealogy, he's got an architectural background. He knows a great deal about the history of Paisley and Renfrewshire, and is a very, very useful person to know if you want to know these things. This conference basically came out of one of his talks. We were passing the Swashot's cottage. Somebody mentioned the name Christian Shaw, and we ended up with the 300th anniversary of the linen thread. Stephen will explain that, I hope, later. Why? So Stephen's going to talk about the origins of the linen thread industry, and so instead of me whittling on any further, I'll just ask Stephen to come up and take the stage. Thank you.
It's muted. That's better. I know I couldn't hear myself right. So, I'd called the title of this talk, Linen Thread, Renfrewshire and Scotland, the Legacy of Mrs. Miller. And a few minutes ago, George said about Christian Shaw. So I'll come to that in a minute or two, why I've chosen to stick with Mrs. Miller at the moment. If we look in some of the sort of 19th century, early 19th century and late 18th century histories of Scotland, we keep getting different things coming in about linen thread. A lot of it ignores Paisley and Renfrewshire completely, and I'll come to that later on. But can you move me on to the next slide, George? Yep. The one person who was acknowledged in the sort of late 18th century, 19th century, with introducing fine linen thread and making into Renfrewshire was Christian Miller of Bergavin. And she's better known to us as Christian Shaw, the 11-year-old girl who caused the Bergavin witch hunt in 1696, 1697. But after that, I think we move on to the next slide again, George. Yep. She marries the minister of Kilmore's in Ayrshire, the Reverend John Miller, in September 1719. Again, that seems strange. It seems strange to me. You know, she's in Erskine, he's in Ayrshire. What's the connection? It turned out he was actually licensed by the Paisley Presbytery as a trainee minister. So he did his training under the auspices of Paisley Presbytery, and then when he was graduated, he was appointed as the minister of Ayrshire at Kilmore's. So it was a case of, she probably met him locally and something developed over time. It was a short-lived marriage though. They had a possible son born on the 11th of August 1720 in Kilmore's. It's in the baptismal record, but there's no mention of him after that in the record books. And then suddenly in 1721, John Miller dies while visiting the family at Bergavin House in Erskine, and he was buried in Erskine Kirkyard. That's now Bishopton Parish Church. So he was buried there, and it was a case of Christian Shaw disappears from the history books after that again for a wee while. But what we're told eventually is, if we move on to the next slide, this is what's going to get complicated, George. I think I've got a few slides coming up. I'll need to have a look at it, yep. Following John's death, Christian returned to Bergavin and shortly departed on a European tour with her mother. When they were in Denmark, she observed craftsmen producing very fine linen thread to a much higher quality than could be produced in Scotland at this point in time. Up until this point, anything that was linen thread manufactured, it was like a yarn. It was suitable for weaving, but not for sewing. If you wanted to sew, you had to import it from the Netherlands or from England. We weren't producing a fine linen sewing thread at all. But while she was in Denmark, she spoke to the thread makers. She got different bits of information out of them, how they actually worked with it, and made notes. It said that after she'd spoken to them, she would go away, get her notebook out and write down what she had been told. On her return to Bergavin, she asked a Glasgow merchant to acquire some of the equipment that she had seen in the Netherlands, and she started experimenting with the thread technology there. She brought in a thread twisting mill. This is an illustration of it out of the Renfrewshire Local History Forum's journals. It was drawn by Stuart Nisbet, who did a lot of work in the cotton industry in Renfrewshire. And I think there's 12 bobbins of linen thread at the top of the machine, and they're each spun down into 2 bobbins go into one. They're spinning 2 twines basically into the one. And it was all hand powered. You can see the man or the woman at the right hand side turning the wheel. It was all hand powered. And it stayed like that. Linen thread production stayed like that for a long while in Scotland, up until the 1780s, 1790s or thereabouts, when they started to use water power as well. But Christian experimented with the different techniques. It was everything from dressing the raw flax to twisting and bleaching it so that it was a nice white thread. She established the Bergavin Thread Company in probably the dining room of Bergavin House, but the business soon outgrew the set-up there, and she eventually moved into the Bridge of Johnston, where she established a small thread mill. Even then it probably wouldn't be big. It probably wouldn't be any bigger than the size of this room, maybe over 2 floors. So it was still small cottage industry really. But the location of that mill is still a mystery. We don't know where it was, but it was somewhere around the Bridge of Johnston. So you're looking, if you know Johnston, it's down in the area where Peyton's Mill and, well, Morrison's is now across the river. It's in that sort of area, but we don't know where. One of the things that helped grow the Bergavin Company was her neighbour, Lady Blantyre at Erskine House, better known to us today as Marlodge Hotel at Erskine. Lady Blantyre had a house in Bath, and when she went down to Bath, she took samples of the Bergavin threads with her. And the ladies in Bath liked that thread. They found it better than the thread they were using for lace making. So Christian instantly had an instant supply chain down to Bath for the ladies there. And they used the family coat of arms as a trademark. Soon as products were in demand and there was newspaper adverts appearing for it. I never put any up on the screen today, but there's 2 or 3 surviving examples of the adverts. We're told that embroiderers and lace makers as far south as Honiton in Devon were asking for Bergavin thread. I just wish we had books relating to the Bergavin Thread Company that told us where they were selling it to, but we don't have that. We've not found those yet. There's very little evidence for the thread itself. Can we move on to the next picture? Yep. Looking through the journal of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, I came across a reference to several items being donated to the Society's museum in about 1880 or thereabouts, and they talked about bits of bowls and kitchen furniture from Bergavin House, but the one thing that struck out to me was it said 2 bobbins of Bergavin thread. So I contacted one of the curators and she sent me this picture back based on what was in the book, and I wish I had a pointer with me. At the bottom we've got this big bobbin with red thread, which to me I think is a bit later. It's more like a turkey red dye. But the one at the top is quite a small bobbin, and it's gone yellow with age, but it is a white linen thread. And it appears to be the only surviving example of Bergavin thread, which is stored somewhere in the National Museum stores in Edinburgh. I tried again to speak to a few curators recently to try and actually get in and see it and get better photographs of it, but I've had no successes yet. But hopefully within the next few weeks I might manage that again. It's just a case, emails take a lot of time. I don't know what that noise is from. but it's there. I've still not seen it ever. I've just had this one photograph of it. I think I've had it for about 5 or 6 years now. But we know it's there. But Bergavin Fred really sparked an industry in Renfrewshire. I'll come to it later on in the later part of the talk. But I mean, from Christian Shaw starting this up in 1722, 300 years ago just now, within 10 to 30 years, we had 80 to 90 linen thread manufacturers in Paisley copying her technology. So it was a case of, you know, she was the first start. You here for the conference? Come on in. It's okay. Excuse me. It's Christian Shaw's story is one of the remarkable ones at the time. We have the Bergavin Fred Company, and she seems to disappear into society at different times. If we go to the next slide, George. I think that's, yep. I don't know how well it comes out in this screen, but this is a picture I found of, I think it's Dutch linen thread workers, and they're actually using different techniques for spinning the linen thread coming through. But one of the things we've got to think about is the difference between yarn and thread. I think this picture is actually for making linen yarn. The basic production for both the yarn, which you would weave with, and the fine thread was very similar. It was spun on a traditional spinning wheel by women in the home, and thereafter, to make the thread, 3 or more strands of the previously spun linen yarn were then twisted mechanically into a very strong twine, and this provided many times the strength that a single strand of the yarn would have. And the end use for the thread was for sewing or the lace making, and by contrast, the single-stranded hand-spun yarn was for use in the weaver's room. And to be honest, when we get into the cotton industry, it's the same thing. There's a lot of confusion at times between when we talk about the cotton mills and the thread mills. I mean, Paisley is well known for the cotton thread industry. It was cotton threads that we made here. But if you go out to the likes of New Lanark or the Stanley mills, which are cotton mills again, but they're actually taking a cotton yarn and weaving it into a final product. So you've got the two differentiations between them. And a lot of people forget about that at times. Next slide, George. This is just a quick one. This is a picture I came across from an old book in about 1721, 1722, and it's just entitled 18th Century Home Linen Production. And it said it's scutching and hackering to obtain the longest, finest fibres. This is the start of the actual process where they're taking the raw flax and breaking it down to get the linen fibres out of the material. It's a pity that John Ennis couldn't make it today, because he was actually going to bring with him samples of raw flax and the final work. He's doing a lot of work just now growing flax all over Scotland in community gardens. And then the idea is they'll actually take it on and produce material from it eventually. But I mean, we know that the Bergavin Thread Company's in Johnston round about 1725, but then it seems to disappear. We don't get anything coming from it. And it was always a question, if you read the old histories of Paisley, even if you go online today to paisley.org and other sort of heritage sites, a lot of time the story says that Christian Shaw disappeared into Edinburgh society and was never heard of again. That's what the story was when I started researching her, I don't know how many years ago, for the Renfrewshire Witch Hunt project. And when I started researching her, the first thing I did was go onto the genealogy records at Scotland's People and actually try and trace, well, what did happen to her. So if we go to the next slide, George. What we discover, I'm hoping, yep, I can't see what's on the screen, unfortunately, unless I come forward. We know that Christian married for a second time in 1737 to a William Livingston, who was a glove maker in the heart of Edinburgh. And quite often that's where the traditional witch hunt story ends. She said that she marries him and he's never heard of again. I've looked at her in a lot more detail, and one of the questions I had was, how did she meet this William, and why did she end up in Edinburgh? It seems quite a big jump going from Erskine in this area all the way over to Edinburgh. And an obscure reference in a unpublished book on the Coats thread mills led me to go to Edinburgh to have a look at the records for the Board of Fisheries, Trade and Manufacturing, which was set up in Edinburgh in 1727. And it was the government's way of trying to boost industry within Scotland at the time. In the minute books, I was able to finally, after reading for 4 or 5 months worth of records, I suddenly came across, and this will be the next slide, George, I hope. Is it the mouse disappeared again? Let me have a quick look. Okay, well, there's the... That's, just use those. Oh, it's not coming up very well here. But this is a photograph I took of the Board of Trade records. And it's dated the 3rd of November, 1727. There should be another one before that, but never mind. Nope, there's not though. Maybe that is the first one. What's the date of that one? September. That's the one I'm after. On the extract dated the 29th of September 1727, it stated that Mrs. Miller is desired to be present at their next meeting. And I thought, well, that's promising. Mrs. Miller, that's who I'm looking for. And I just continued reading on, and if you go to the next one, George. 3rd of November 1727, again it says that Lord Monsey and Messrs Macaulay, Drummond and Patterson, who are trustees, are recommended to converse with Mrs. Miller of Johnston, now in town, to bring in her proposals for spinning and twisting thread. So I thought, okay, this is definitely the person that I've been looking for. And I thought, well, what's she doing talking about spinning and twisting thread? Is she trying to get money to boost what she's doing and develop it on? So if we go to the next slide, things start to move very quickly. Next one again, George. Sorry, that's my fault. We have set it up. On the 12th of April 1728, this is only a couple of months on, we find the evidence for her move to Edinburgh. Mrs. Miller of Johnston is appointed as the first mistress of the new Edinburgh Spinning School at a salary of £50 per annum. Though I still wasn't convinced that we're looking at Christian Shaw, to be honest. At the same time, they established another 2 or 3 spinning schools, and I know that the Glasgow Spinning School mistress was only paid £25, so half the amount of money than this Mrs. Miller was getting. The crucial information actually came the following year, in 1729, when they were paying her the annual salary again. And in it, it actually says that the money is being given to Mrs. Christian Shaw, relict of the Reverend John Miller of Kilmore's, as payment for her duties as the mistress of the spinning school in Edinburgh. So suddenly it's gone from Mrs. Miller back to Christian Shaw, relict of the minister at Kilmore's. And from that point on, she's referred to as either Mrs. Miller or Christian Shaw. And I think she's really kept her own name throughout. Is there another picture coming up there, George, if you move on? I think that's the 1729 extract. I'm going to have to go back and re-photograph all of these at a better, higher resolution, I think, so you can see them better on the screens. So I started doing a lot more work. If we move on, looking at the spinning schools. We already had the date of the 12th of April as the date she was appointed from the Board of Trade and Manufacturers minutes. But I've discovered another document about 3 or 4 months ago in the Edinburgh City Archives. And that came through a PhD that was published in 1950s, where the author of the PhD basically said that, it's what was on the screen here. She said that the Edinburgh Spinning School was set up to teach 30 girls how to spin flax into yarn fit for thread or cambric, and also the twisting of thread, breeching, milning, hanking, back rowing, and upmaking of the same. And the same school was to teach 6 poor apprentices from the Boys of Heriot's Hospital in Edinburgh. I thought, well, that's interesting. It's giving this sort of oversight of what the school was going to do, but especially the bit about actually teaching 6 boys as well. Chasing his references, the actual author had put 2 references into the Edinburgh City Archives of documents where he'd found his information. What they call Moses Bundle 157, number 6023, and Bundle 160, 6135 are the sources of his information. So this is while we're still going through lockdown almost, and the archives still hadn't been open to people getting in. So I sent him the 2 references, and one of the archivists sent me back photographs of both documents. The first one I looked at had nothing to do with Christian Shaw at all. It was to do with a lawyer, or actually making applications for building warrants in Edinburgh. And I thought, well, that's pointless for that. But the second one was extremely useful. And I think if you pull up the next screen, George, it should be a picture of the front page, and it's the actual contract between the City of Edinburgh and Mrs. Miller, and it's dated the 2nd and the 5th of February, 1728. And it's 13 pages in total, with the cover page. So it was a very useful document. In the document itself, if you move on to the next one, George, it starts off by saying, at Edinburgh, the 2nd and 5th of February, 1728 years, is contracted, agreed, and fully ended between the following parties. And he goes on to list to the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, Thomas Fenton, Alexander James Watson, and James Frintas Baileys, and a couple of other people who was Patrick Lindsay, Dean of Guild, and James Donaldson, the Treasurer of Edinburgh, as the signatories from the City of Edinburgh, representing the whole town council and community of the same, and then Mistress Christian Shaw, relict of John Miller. So it's a goldmine of information about what is going to happen at the school. To be honest, I've still not finished reading it. I've gone through some of it, I've taken out extracts from it. If you move on to the next slide, George. Is that the same one, actually? Hang on. No. It basically tells us that the council have nominated Christian Shaw as mistress of the public school erected in Edinburgh for teaching girls to spin the flax and fine yarn fit for thread making and cambrics. And she'll get £50 sterling a year from them. And the commissioners and trustees for improving fisheries and manufactures in Scotland, out of the public money which is under their management, will basically pay for this. So although the contracts between Edinburgh and Christian, it's the Board of Trade that are passing the money over to them to do it. And it tells us that the contract basically will run for 9 years from April 17, I've forgotten the date, 1728, and then we know it was then renewed in 1737, so she must have been doing a good job. But what we find is, if you move on again, and hopefully I'm on the same one, number 2, yep. In order for Christian to actually carry out her duties, she's basically told how the school's run. Edinburgh will basically give her accommodation, and then they'll find a home for the school as well. The school, on the first day of April 1728, will receive 20 girls, and within the space of 6 months next thereafter, 10 or more, at least aged 8 from 8 to 14, will be added to the school. And what I found is the first 20 are basically being trained in spinning the linen, and then the further 10 are actually there to learn how to do the twisting. So they're teaching it in 2 parts. They're doing the spinning first, and then they're moving on to the twisting. Excuse me. The Provost and the magistrates and the successors are to appoint the girls that are going into the school out of either the merchants and trades hospitals for girls. So that it's basically the workers or anybody that's involved in the merchants' families or the trade families that are poor, they will actually be chosen for the school first above anyone else. And when you read the book, it's going on more so about if the girls aren't up to the job, they will be taken out of the school and somebody else will be put in their place. So they want to make sure whoever's in the school's the best quality trainee they can find at the time. And if we move to the next one, I'm just going to grab a sip of water. Christians also told what she has to teach them, probably based on what she's already told the Board of Trade and Edinburgh City Council about what she has developed in Paisley in Renfrewshire. And she's to teach all of the scholars under her charge to dress flax and to spin it into fine yarn fit for making thread or cambric. But she's also to teach the twisting of the thread, breeching, milling, hanking or reeling, and the back rowing and upmaking of the said, and that she shall not conceal any part of her art and knowledge in such matters from them. So she's to teach everything. And she's also told that she is to employ somebody to teach, an expert in spinning, one in twisting, one in milling, one in hanking or reeling, back rowing and upmaking. So though she's the mistress, she's actually to take on other people to help train the girls as well. So she's going to take on a spinner and such like. And they have to attend the school, I think it's every day while the school is in session. And what I found more interesting still was the times for the school are even given. The morning session is 9 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then from 2 p.m. until 8 p.m. in the afternoon. So it's a long day. It's not because today finishing school at 3 o'clock and going in at 9. It's a long day completely. How are we doing? And if we move on, George. Yep. It goes on to say that it's hereby agreed that the said Christian shores to have the profits that shall arise from the labour of her scholars during the first 6 months of the school, or after being received into the school, and within the space of 6 months, any of them shall be found to be incapable of being taught spinning in a manner provided, they are to be dismissed. So within that 6 months, if they're not any good at it, that's them out of the school. The provost and the magistrates were to oversee the school, and they appointed, I think it was 6 people to actually visit the school regularly to make sure they were being taught in the correct manner. And they were to inquire into the proficiency of the scholars and the care and condition, or so the conduct of the mistress, and probably the staff that she had as well. What was even more interesting was to set the prices for the work of the students too. If we move on, George, we're told that spinning 5 spindles of yarn in the little pound, they were being given 24 pence. And it goes on down, like, so there's 3.5 spindle yarn in the little pound, 18 pence. I think when they talk about the little pound, they're probably talking about the Scots pound rather than the pound sterling at the time. And it goes down all the way to 1 spindle of yarn being given 12 pence. So even though they were at school, the girls are actually being given so much money for producing a quantity of yarn, because that yarn will eventually be sold on. I think the spinning students were given 5 pence sterling a week to actually come to the school, and then they sort of made it up with the extra money that they were producing at the time. After the 6 months were up, any of the profits made were then split between Christian as a mistress and the students. 1/3 of the money went to Christian, and 2/3 was split between the 20 spinners. The 10 scholars who were learning the twisting didn't receive the 5 shillings. They received money based on the amount of yarn that was actually twisted. And it says, if any of the girls are employed in breeching, they will get 3 pence per day on that subject, and they will retain the full profit that may arise from their work. And Shaw was obliged to keep a day book detailing how the scholars were employed in their work, if they were spinning, twisting, how much yarn they produced, how many bobbins they were producing as well, all of that, so they had to keep very good records. And she was also obliged to pay regular maintenance to the hospital for the upkeep of the girls. What I should say is, when we talk about the hospitals then, mix of the merchants' hospital and the trades' hospital, they were more like schools. It wasn't a hospital as we know it. It was somewhere where the poor merchants could send their children for their education. So they were being, it wasn't as bad as a poorhouse, but it was a step in between the two. And of course, well, Merchison's Hospital sort of still survives today, but it's this Merchison School in Edinburgh. You've got Harriet's Hospital as well, which is now Harriet's School. And they just, over time, it became more the school aspect of it that was taken in. If we move to the next one, this is just what was given up about the Is it moving on? No? Nope. That's what I was just talking about, that one. That's it, on to the boys. In the PhD, it was said that Shaw was obliged to instruct 6 poor boys. In the actual contract, which it actually says she was only to teach 4 boys. So he's mucked up his number somewhere from reading the contract to putting it into the PhD. The boys themselves, I've not actually put it in there. In the first year of the school, she was to admit 1 boy as an apprentice weaver, weaving the tape, or, what did it say there? Weaving of tape or knittings. She was to take on the 1 person in the first year. In the second year, she would take on a 2nd apprentice. The 3rd year, a 3rd one. So each year, they had a different apprentice at each different stage. And by the time they got to year 5, the first boy would have left, and they would bring in somebody new and start the process over again with it. The funding for the boys, I never actually talked about the funding for the school on a way through. Edinburgh had to fund the school. Apart from the salary for the teacher, they had to fund the house that she was living in, the school itself. They put a tax duty onto the beer and the ale, and that was 2 pence in every pint that was sold in Edinburgh. So they were taxing people then to make the education system work. And they said that it would be the same duty in beer and ale as the girls to entertain the full term of the apprenticeships coming in. But the one interesting thing is, if we go to the next one, George, at the end of the contract, it talks about show herself. And it says that the city is obliged to pay Christian £15 to defray the expenses of transporting herself and family from Johnston, where her residence is now, to Edinburgh, and to provide her with a house necessary to lodge her family from Whitsunday next, and either from or after Whitsunday next during the residence of 9 years. It almost repeats itself. It talks about providing her with a dwelling house to accommodate her family, with a schoolhouse and a house necessary to carry on her said undertaking. I think it's probably the language of the day. They're just emphasising it over and over in the contract that they will be providing this. But from that, what I took out of it was Christian Shaw and family. Does that mean that the son that she had in Kilmores was still living with her and moved to Edinburgh at the same time? Only read that last week, so it's something I've still to look at in Scotland's people at the National Records Office. But I can start looking for a John Miller over there doing anything, getting married or dying in the future. But that was something that was really telling the story. We know that the contract seemed to go well. It was renewed in 1737, but what happened to Christian after that? And if you go to the next page, I think, yep, this is just a sample of the contract. I just put the one page in just to let you see it. It's actually, when you actually see it on the computer screen, it's actually quite readable. Just a lot of information there to take in. On this screen, I don't think you'll be able to make much out of it at all. But it's 13 pages, and that's page 10 and 11, and the top paragraph at the left is talking about the £15 payment for the moving expenses. I've got a reference for the second renewal of the contract, but that's the one I can't find in Edinburgh City Archives. The archivists there haven't been very helpful so far in tracking it down to see if it's not in our handwritten index, it's not there. But it's obviously there because I know at least another 2 people have now referenced it in the past. So we've got to try and find it. Another document, if you move to the next slide, oh, that was the zoom in. If you go to the next one, this is a slightly later document. This is June 1729, and I found this a few years ago. It provides even more insight into the spinning school itself. The letter is from Christian Shaw to Sir John Clark of Pennycook, who was effectively almost like the equivalent of the Chancellor of Scotland at the time. He was chair of the Board of Trade and Manufacturers as well, and it was thanking him for a donation to the girls of the spinning school. And I think it's possibly the 10 girls that were involved in the twisting that were actually being given the money. And I'll come to the reason for that in a moment. Unusually, within the document, if you move on one more, on the back, this is a letter on the left-hand side, and you'll get Christian Shaw's signature down at the bottom right-hand corner. But on the back of the page, there's a handwritten receipt signed by the 10 girls that were receiving the money from the donation. The top one is Elizabeth or Betty Gray, who receives £1, 5 shillings, and she is basically thanking Sir John Clark of Pennycook for the money that was given to her from him from Christian Shaw. And all of the entries are very similarly worded, but we've got the names of the 10 girls: Elizabeth Gray, Helen Resway, a Rachel Smith, probably a Rachel Good, a Betty Frail, a Janet Anderson, Elizabeth Atkinson, a Grail Nisbet, an Ina Mearns, and Agnes Watson. And as you go down the list, they're all getting less money. It goes from about 8 shillings to 5 shillings to 4 shillings to 3 shillings. And I think the money's distributed to those that need it more. So if you've got more, if you're maybe doing a better job, you're making more money. I think I was going to move on here. If you'll pull the next one up, George. That was just zooming in again. I don't know how well you'll see it, but this is what's in the bottom left-hand corner of the actual back of the letter. I've just turned it around so you can actually see the handwritten names. And this is all in Christian Shaw's handwriting. And it's the only physical contact we've got at the moment of Christian Shaw herself, from the witch hunts or from the linen industry. This is the only handwritten document. Technically, I shouldn't even be showing it at the moment because I'm not given permission to. It's still in the possession of the Clark of Pennycook family. It's deposited in the National Archives, so I managed to get a copy of it, but I need to actually write to them and say, can I use this document? But it's too important not to show anybody at the moment. It also suggests that the Edinburgh Spinning School is based in the Merchants' Hospital. At the time, it's a bit hard to see, but at the very top of the first page it says Merchants' Hospital, and it then gives the date. So that was, to me, suggests that's where the actual spinning school is. If you move to the next slide, George. I've been doing a wee bit of detective work. This is Edinburgh around about 1717 to 1746. And if you click once at the moment, I have highlighted the Merchant School, which is up beside a college. If you do it again, over at the left-hand side here, we've got Harriet's Hospital, which is still Harriet's School today. You've got Greyfriars Church in the middle. We know that the Merchants' Hospital for girls moved to Bristol Street in about 17 something. If you click it again, this is Bristol Street running down here, and we think that is probably the site of the Merchants' Girls' Hospital there. It needs a lot more work to confirm it. It's not named on the map as that, but it's probably just coming in as it comes at that point in time. That area has been completely redeveloped. I think if you click the next slide on, try again. Nope. I thought I had another picture coming in with it, but I don't. It was really a case, after this figuring out what the school was, I thought, well, what did happen to Christian Shaw? We know that she married William Livingston in 1737. I think it's around about February or March that year, if even April. So I did some digging, and for September, on the 8th of September 1737, I found this in the burial register for Greyfriars Kirk, and it's Christian Shaw, spouse to William Livingston Glover. And it tells you, well, we don't know what the middle two columns are for, but at the right hand side, it's got a few characters, and then it says E. Todd's tomb. E. Todd was an old Provost of Edinburgh from the 17th century, so he was 1660s, 1680s or thereabouts. And so she seems to have been buried at his tomb. So she dies quite suddenly in September that year. What of, we don't know, it doesn't tell us. But if we look at the entry for August, August starts up above, and it talks about pneumatic and nervous fevers are very frequent and deadly this month. Likewise, the smallpox continues to rage. So it's possible that she succumbed to one of these diseases quite suddenly. I mean, going from signing a new contract in April that year and then dying 6-7 months later, it wasn't very good. So if you move on to the next one, George, I think it all pops up. That's better. This is Provost Todd's tomb. It sits against the Recordng wall and basically backs on towards Harriet's school. And what I've done, the arrow's pointing you to, I think it's number 17 on the map. And that's the location of it at the back of the church. If you look through the burial record, there are 300 or 400 burials at Provost Todd's tomb. So there's no way everybody could be within the space. It's not a big area. You've got the white on the map as a pathway, and it's maybe about 8 metres between the path and the wall. But what I did when I was in the graveyard, I had a look at it, and I'm going to come to the other side of the screen for a minute. If you look at this part of the map, there's a set of steps which takes you down, and at the foot of those steps there's a wee grate, and it takes you into a chamber under the ground. And I'm beginning to wonder if there's actually quite a large burial tomb under there where a lot of the burials were placed at that point in time. It could be, I've not been able to speak to anybody about the graveyard. Nobody seems to know anything about it. I've spoken to people at the church and they say, oh, we don't know anything about the graveyard. And there is a graveyards officer for the World Heritage Site in Edinburgh, but trying to track her down and actually talk to her has been a hard part as well. I've known her for years from other projects in Galloway, but just trying to get a response out hasn't been easy at the moment. So this was Christian's last burial place. If I want to move on and have a wee look at the legacy of Christian, so, yep. What did the other, I'm going to move on myself, what did other books say about her? And to sum it up in one word, not much. There's 2 books. The first one is Irene F. Deans published a book in 1930 in Scottish spinning schools. And when I found it on a second-hand bookshop, I thought this will tell me what we need to know. Christian Shaw is not mentioned in it once. If you pull up the next picture, it should... Oh, that's it. What it does talk about is different things, and it brings us back to Renfrewshire in a way. This is, if I can find my notes for it here. Yep, chapter 2 of the Spinning School book talks about Mrs. Elizabeth Muir of Caldwell, another 18th century lady of Renfrewshire who published a survey of 18th century customs. I should have put it into my notes. But she talks about how people were dressing at the time. Talks about the young gentlemen who at this time were growing more delicate, got their cloth from Holland for shirts, but the old was satisfied with necks and sleeves of the fine, which were put on a loose above the country cloth. And she says, I remember in 1730-31 of a ball where it was agreed that the company should be dressed in nothing but what was manufactured in the country. My sisters were well dressed as any, and their gowns were striped linen at 2 shillings and 6pence per yard. Their heads and ruffles were Paisley muslins at 4 and 6pence, with 4-penny edging from Hamilton, all of them the finest that could be had. A few years after this, weavers were brought over from Holland and a manufactory for linen established in the West. The last paragraph is wrong because we're manufacturing linen in Scotland in this area long before that, But this is what she remembers happening at the time. And I think what she's remembering is the sudden growth in the linen thread industry in Paisley and Renfrewshire just coming up. In the book, she also talks about an earlier volume published in 1726 by Woodrow in what was his An Electa, as it was called, and it was republished by the Maitland Club in the 19th century. And that's where you see the quote that was underneath. It said, "This summer there seems to be a very great inclination through the country to improve our own manufactory, and especially in linen and hemp." And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder why 1726 is what's happening in Erskine. Christian Shaw's starting this linen thread manufacturing, and suddenly the word is spreading and everybody's talking about it. I mean, chapter 5 of her book talks about the spinning schools of the Board of Trustees for Fisheries and Manufacturing, which was established in 1727. And she states that at the General Convention of November 1726, there was a suggestion made that a sum of money be applied for encouragement of young children between the age of 8 and 14 to dress and spin flax and hemp, along with coarse wool, at charity schools and other schools. And her assumption is that the schools referred to would be the charity schools and the schools that were run by the Society in Scotland for the propagation of Christian knowledge. But as we've seen from what happened within the year or 2 years, it was completely different. I think it was Christian Shaw had been talking to the Board of Trade for a lot longer and taking everything on. There's not one mention of Christian Shaw or a Mrs. Miller or even a Mrs. Livingston within her book at all. There's another book published in 1864, and if we move on to the next slide, George, yep. It's called, if I can read it myself here, The Linen Trade, Ancient and Modern by Alex Warden, who was a merchant in Dundee in 1864. And he talks about Paisley. I'm going to have to come this way to look at it myself. And he talks about Paisley sort of looking at coarse checked linen cloth and bengals, and afterwards of checked linen handkerchiefs, some of them fine and beautifully variegated in colouring. They then talk about the different plain ones, the linen gauze. Then they talk about the manufacturing of white sewing thread known as ounce thread to distinguish it from the different kinds of coloured and white thread, then made in Aberdeen and Dundee, was begun about 1750. It was introduced to the neighbourhood from Holland in 1725 and carried on for a long time in the family of the lady who first learned the secret and began the trade. And as in Glasgow, the cotton manufacture finally supplanted that of linen in Paisley. I thought, well, that's interesting, but the dates are wrong again. We know it was a lot earlier in the town. I've not put it in, have I? Typical. If you move to the next slide, George. In 1787, William Carryle of the Bankhead Mill at Carryle Press. If you're from Paisley, who's heard of the Bankhead Mill at Carryle Press? Virtually nobody. It was one of the first and earliest linen thread mills in Paisley, purpose-built for the job. I've got a slide out of place, so if you jump on to George at the moment, yep. This is a book from Stuart Nisbet's work on the cotton industry, and this was looking at the weaving manufactories more so. You can see that Paisley, the linen weaving really starts, the weaving 1738 through to 1767, Kilbarcon Linen Factory, Wachwinner, Cumberland Manufactory. It's St Mirren Wind in Paisley. He's got that wrong. It's New Street. You've got the Paisley Stocking Factory in Snedden, Kerr Moody and Co in Paisley, the Orchard Weaving Factory. But he never looked at the winning thread side of it. He was looking mostly at the others. If you move on, I've done a lot of work on the Carlisle family. The original John Carlisle, who came to Paisley, was born in Annan in 1703, and he arrived in Paisley in 1742 with the sole intention of opening up a linen thread factory in the town. This is only 20 years after Christian Shaw had started the work. And they established a small thread factory on New Sneddon Street, and over time it developed into quite a big concern. As the firm grew, they opened up a quay called Carlisle Quay off New Sneddon Street. There was Carlisle Lane, Carlisle Place. So they gave their name to part of the street itself. But his sons William, who was born in 1746, and James, born in 1752, and a third one, Alexander, born in 1788, continued their father's work in the town. If you move to the next slide, hopefully this is quite visible. This is to try and give you a location. The big white roof that you see at the right-hand side of the white cart is the Pure Gym and, I'm going to say Home Bargains, but that doesn't sound right. B&M, that's it. But if you do another quick, George, Carlisle Quay is this area in here. And again, the Bankhead Mill site was this rectangular spot of ground roughly. And again, the grey area here was Greenbank House, the actual home of the Carlisle family themselves. And if we do it once more, just to give you, we've got the Bascule footbridge, which has just been refurbished, running across the river here, which was put in, I can't remember the date it was put in, but it was put in to give workers at White's factory, which is just a bit further down Harbour Road, quicker access across the river. And when the footbridge, when White stopped using a lot of workers, they took the mechanism out of the Bascule Bridge and just cut it off and left it as a solid footbridge across the river. But if you move on, this is it in the 1850s. You can see the Bankhead Mill coming in the river. You've got Carlisle Quay down up at the top of this map, Carlisle Place running down to meet it, and a big house, Greenbank House, down here. If you move on again, George, this is where you can see the remains of the mill as it was in the 1950s, photographed by Professor John Hume. And it's 4 flats with a basement to it. Not wide, when you look at the width of it, it's not very wide at all. And you can see the Bascule Bridge coming in here with the pipe running across at the foot of Carlisle Lane. And if you do another one, you see the front facades of it. The buildings have been built at 2 different times. And I've got a sneaky feeling the building to the right-hand side with the very steep roof is probably from the 18th century. And the one to the left is a later addition in the 19th century. And if you do it again, George, this was under demolition just before. It eventually became a rover garage site. And I think there's another one. Yep, that didn't need to be there. That's just another view of New Sneddon Street. Try again. Yep, Carlisle Quay itself. Up until very recently, there was actually the remains of this crane still sitting on Carlisle Quay itself. I don't know what happened to it. It just seemed to disappear overnight. Well, this is probably about 20 years ago now. The first time the council had refurbished the area, and the crane just disappeared, but it was there for a long while. I think you'll need to skip 2 slides this time, George. Oh. Which way are you going? That's it. Just to finish up, what I thought I would do is have a look at some of the other textile industries in the town in the 1780s. 1783 was the year the first trade directory for Glasgow and the west of Scotland was published. And, well, I never talked about it. William Carryle wrote an article for the Gentleman magazine in 1784. And in that, he actually talks about the state of the Paisley textile industry. And he talks about, for the linen thread manufacturing, he talks about there being 80 thread manufacturers in the town at that point in time. So I eventually got myself a copy of the directory. 1783, we've got one cotton manufacturer in the town, and that's Jameson and Co. Cotton Manufacturers in Abbey Street. You probably find that was the Abbey Mill. Where we're standing today, I know it's called the Abbey Mill Business Centre. It was never known as the Abbey Mill in its lifetime. The Abbey Mill was directly opposite the west front of Paisley Abbey. So that's the only one that we had in 1783 for the cotton industry. You click on, George. We've got the silk industry, which was quite big. We've got 17 silk companies in Paisley at the time. You've got, up at number 2, you've got John Clark, silk fish maker in the Snedden, as in probably the father of the John. It might even be the same John Clark that opened the Anchor Thread Works here. They were Weavers Furnitures before. And then you've got Ellis, silk manufacturers in the Snedden, Elliott and Dibbs, Ferrier, Pollock and Company, Messrs Fulton, silk manufacturers at Maxwellton. The Fultons were better known as Fultons of the Glen up in Glenburn. So you've got James Roundus there, John Love Silk in New Street, James Love, probably a brother, in Abbey Street, William Twigg Silk at the Bridge End. Twiggs eventually ended up with a big mill down at the foot of New Snedden Street, where the five-a-side pitches are now. William and John Wallace Silk in the Snedden. So you can see they were spread out over the town. The silk industry was quite big at that point in time as well. What else do we have? That's the same slide. Oh no, you'll need to change it, George. I'm forgetting I'm not changing it. Dyers. I thought dyers would be quite a big industry at the time. Only 2 of them appear in the trade directory. John Cochrane, dyer at Sauso, and William King, a dyer in Dyer's Wynd. But what I realised was the trade directories were like the yellow pages of today. You paid to be advertising in them. So this only gives you an idea that those companies were big enough to actually be able to afford to put an entry into a book, especially a first edition of one. So you probably find it's only a small proportion of those that actually participated in it. We've also got yarn merchants. John Cochrane, yarn merchant in the High Street. I've got a sneaky feeling that Cochrane's one of the ancestors of the department store, who became big haberdashers at the time. John Knox, a yarn merchant again in the High Street. William Stewart, linen draper and haberdasher. And Hugh Wilson, yarn merchant. And I've just realised the one slide that doesn't seem to be there is the one about the thread makers. There's actually about 22 thread makers named. I don't know why I've not got it there. I must have deleted it by mistake, which is a shame. But it mentions in fact, that it was there, but I skipped over it. I had it in the wrong position. Yep. It was 22 linen thread manufacturers in 1783. You've got the Carryle family that I just talked about, but then there was others. John Barber in Maxwellton. There's a George Birkmeyer in the High Street. Robert Bigger in Cossyside. Robert Brown in the Snedden. I'm trying to pick up any other big sort of Paisley names that are still about. There's a John Caldwell in the Snedden. But none of the early thread manufacturers really seemed to make it into sort of the early 19th century or 1820s, when Coates and Clarks are moving into the cotton. And I think once they started producing the cotton threads, linen thread almost just disappears. It survives in the likes of Johnston with Peyton's Mill and such like, But in Paisley, the cotton really does take over. Carriles moved from the linen into cotton quite fast, and by 1860 they were part of the Clarkin Company thread mills. So the Clarks had taken them over and basically shut down what was happening at New Snedden, and then sort of moved everything over here. And it was the same. You've got the Cumberland thread works on the foot of New Street. Earlier when I showed you the slide, the picture about the Cumberland weaving factory, that becomes a thread works, and again Clarkin Company take it over. And it's the way Coates and Clarks worked. They just took over everybody that was doing something and incorporated it into their own works. I mean, when Clarkin Company started, well, some of the early adverts talk about, it's not the Anchor thread works, it's the Seedhill, Cumberland and Bankhead thread works. So they're keeping the three names of the three different mills going over all that time. Let me try and get back to where I was in my own notes. That's in the wrong position too. Typical. But we're talking about earlier on I mentioned the book from 1850s that talks about Paisley and talks about the thread industry in Aberdeen and Dundee. If you move to the next slide, George. I picked up this from, it's Aberdeen City Council, it's one of Aberdeen City Council's heritage pages. Aberdeen, a comparison. It says, linen manufacture was introduced to Aberdeen about 1745, and it soon grew so large to pay some £5,000 a year in wages. In the articles of thread, sailcloth, Osnabrooks, brown linens, and sacking, employing between 2,000 and 3,000 hands. The thread manufacture was introduced at a later date, and the spinning was soon carried out to great perfection. It employed about 600 men, 2,000 women, and about 100 boys in 1795. And the book from 1850s was saying that the thread production was happening in Aberdeen and Dundee a lot earlier. So there's a lot of misdirection in sort of the 19th century history books about what's actually coming out. It's only the work that's really going on now that's really showing any difference. But if you move on, George, I'm finishing up here. And I realise what the time is now. The legacy of Christian Shaw, I mean, in the last few days, we've been talking about, with the death of the Queen, how it was when she ascended the throne in 1952 about a woman in a man's world. Christian Shaw was exactly the same back in 1720s, 1730s, when she was talking to the Board of Trade and Manufacturers, pushing for the ways to sort of develop the spinning schools especially, and the way that she was introducing the linen thread. All of the manufacturers that was listed there, it was all men. And Christian Shaw was the one woman that had really started off the linen industry here and developed it across in Erskine, moving into Johnston and building up in the local area. And it's really on the work that she did in the 1720s that led to the sort of subsequent improvements in the technologies that we could introduce the silk making in Paisley, and then when it came the cotton thread industry. And I do think that if Christian Shaw hadn't started off the linen thread, would we be sitting here today in the Coates and the Clarks thread mills? Would we have had that knowledge to actually develop the work as well as we had done at the time? She really was sort of a woman. Still a lot of work needs done on her to actually show sort of her importance and sort of the thread industry at the time. But it's something I'm hoping, I'm doing this talk again in about 4 weeks' time, a shorter version of it hopefully, but it will actually show how, I want to show how sort of pivotal she was and what happened at the time. I think that's where I'm going to leave it.
Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a nice wee break. So we're now going into our second talk of the afternoon. Our speaker is Lucy McConnell. Now, Lucy is a dress historian who has lived in Paisley for about 9 years and helped out at the Swash Shots, cottages, amongst the other things in the area. She has recently moved to Huddersfield, to the university there, to do a PhD on, sorry, I'll need to look this up. Remember, Second World War, utility clothing, sorry, in the Second World War. So she has a very deep knowledge of history, and she's got a long experience of the shawl stuff. So please welcome Lucy McConnell.
Thank you, George. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you all for coming today. It's so nice to be doing this in person once again. I know throughout lockdown I was able to present with Paisley Philosophical Institution about Paisley shawls, so there's a bit of that in there today. But it's nice to be in person and get hands-on with things as well at the end. So yeah, thank you to everyone at Paisley Philosophical and to Stephen as well, the urban historian, for inviting me today. As George said, I'm a dress and textile historian. I'm currently doing a PhD at Huddersfield Uni. I'm just over a year and a half in, so we're at the, the real juicy bit just now. But my research interests range from 18th century to present day, so hence I'm doing utility clothing for my PhD. I've looked at Paisley shawl for my undergrad, and utility for my masters as well, so I'm kind of building on that research. But it's really nice to be here to celebrate 300 years since the founding of linen thread production in Paisley, and I thought I would present, building on Stephen's talk, as towards the end he discussed a few of the different textiles that were being made here. Towards the latter part of the 18th century, I thought through my paper, which is titled The Hidden Histories of Paisley's Textile Economy through the 18th and 19th century, we'll centrally look at Western women's dress in the late 18th and through the 19th century, because this was the central market for Paisley. Perfect. Thank you so much. So, from silks of gauze to Paisley shawls, Paisley as a textile producer was well known and recognised globally for manufacturing a wide variety of products through the 18th and 19th centuries. The textiles and finished garments manufactured in Paisley could be found in everyday dress and in the most fashionable wardrobes of the elite. From linen, in thread and fabric form, cotton, silk, muslin, embroidery and tapestry, to woven wools making such items as shawls of pine pattern, Paisley plaids and even tartans, textiles of all kinds were made here. The diversity of Paisley's textile output is oftentimes overlooked. The fabric and finished garment manufactured here in Scotland's largest town hold a richness which gained international acclaim through the 18th and 19th centuries. Paisley's textile economy was shaped over these two hugely important centuries, and in this presentation we will look at the hidden histories behind just some of Paisley's textile products. In turn, this presentation seeks to redress the balance of investigation into Paisley's textile past. Through highlighting and exploring the different types of textile goods made here, our examination will draw attention to the people who made such products, exposing the hidden histories of Paisley's textile economy through the 18th and 19th centuries, certainly the heyday of Paisley's textile manufacturing past. Examining the changing nature of Paisley's textile manufacture, we'll address how the textile trades of Paisley shaped and situated the town as a central contributor to local, national and international markets. If we can go to the next slide. In his work of 1880, titled Endymion, Benjamin Disraeli wrote these words: "Keep an eye on Paisley." This comment, spoken by Disraeli's character Job Thornbury, was meant to indicate the radicalism known to be present in Paisley, and as such, that Endymion would be very wary of visiting the town. This utterance is intended to inform the reader that the beginning of political revolution would undoubtedly be founded in Paisley itself. The true meaning behind these words is commonly misconstrued today, the statement shared in a more positive light. However, such concerns over an uprising must be placed within the context which these words were written, at the height of industrial manufacture, population increase and vast urbanisation in Britain. This quote, therefore, sets the groundwork for our investigation of Paisley's textile past today, a highly politically charged period, a time of change and fluctuation in countless ways, and, of course, 2 centuries which cemented Paisley's name within textile history. Next slide, please, Stephen. Particular textile products were certainly well remembered in Paisley and around the world for their connection to the town. Of course, the infamous pine pattern shawl, made in imitation of original cashmere, was so famed for its manufacture here that it earned the epithet Paisley shawl from around the mid-19th century, with the pine pattern itself becoming known as Paisley around the world from then onwards. The connection of this one garment to the town remains strong. However, most people aren't aware that there is a town called Paisley, or indeed that the pattern and the shawl which bear its name came so connected to this place. But what then before the shawl? What was made here? Brilliant questions, and ones which allow us to see the truly awe-inspiring artistic abilities of those working within Paisley's textile industry. Our journey begins in the 18th century, situating production within broader analysis of social, cultural, political, economic and technological change. The 18th century most certainly allows us to witness the emergence of a revolution in industry which was occurring throughout Britain at this time. Different types of textiles were increasingly becoming available to a wider market through the development of techniques and technologies. Paisley at this time was already an established textile centre, with weavers and associated trades adopting new textiles to produce, testament to their skill and craft. The town itself would grow through this period of manufacture and population as a result, and the boundaries of the town would increase to incorporate surrounding villages. Markets on which Paisley were able to retail their goods expanded, in large part due to the 1707 Act of Union with England. As Paisley was so well situated on the River Cart, providing good connections to Glasgow, and from here markets in England, with fashion centres of London and Paris even more further afield, now more accessible than ever. Increasing connectivity throughout Britain and Europe allowed the products of Paisley to reach further afield than in previous years ever before. Coupled with this, rising incomes and the ability to spend amongst the middle class from the 18th century meant that people were able to buy more than ever before, conspicuously consuming to outwardly display their newfound status. This purchasing power was popular with textile goods, and Paisley's products increasingly gained traction. Next slide. Population change was occurring throughout Britain through the early 18th and into the long 19th century, a reflection of what we know now as the Industrial Revolution, a period of technological advancement and related movement of peoples. Migration visible through the relocation of manufacturers to production centres to profit both monetarily and in terms of business acumen was no different in Paisley. The benefits which Paisley had to offer also drew workers here to gain employ across a range of industries, not least in textile manufacture. Early linens were key to Paisley's newly burgeoning textile trade, again growing due to the 1707 Act of Union, which meant importing and transporting raw flax became easier. And upon the introduction of a new product to the town, Paisley's position as a production centre would be bigger than ever before. Silk gauze, a fine, light, relatively sheer fabric, began to be made in Paisley in 1759. This high-quality fabric must be credited as the textile which gave Paisley its status as a producer of quality goods. The raw materials, before being processed, costly in themselves, and the fragility of silk gauze as a finished product adding further to its desirability on the fashion markets of Europe. The history of silk gauze manufacture in Paisley is one of imitation, a common thread running through much of textile production throughout Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and specifically Paisley, as we'll see. Spitalfields in London is probably the most well-remembered of the manufacture of silk through this period. Spitalfields was most certainly enviable as the centre of silk production. In aims of replicating the silks of Spitalfields, in 1759, John Wilson, a weaver employed by one John McConnell, created the first ever silk gauze manufactured in Paisley. McConnell's experimentation, though soon abandoned despite its success, was taken up by his father-in-law, Humphrey Fulton, a former peddler and linen manufacturer. This business venture, despite its monetary risk, was a success, reportedly producing silk gauzes to rival those in Spitalfields. Seeing fast growth under Fulton management, by 1760, in just 1 year alone, 600 silk gauze looms were in operation around Renfrewshire as a whole. It is important to recognise, however, that Fulton alone cannot be acknowledged as the sole reason for silk production in Paisley being such a success as it was. We must consider Fulton's work within its context. In 1760, several factors were at play. Paisley's weavers commanded much lower wages than their London counterparts, who had undertaken protests and countless labour disputes over the passing of the Spitalfields Act that year, and that set a minimum wage for the weavers in Spitalfields that were producing silk. In addition, the concentration of weaving population engaged in Paisley meant connections were strong, as was competition, and growing townscape ripe for industry, manufacturing sites and warehousing reduced living costs and geography as well, alongside travel connections to Glasgow's ports, were extremely attractive. As such, the timing was perfect for Paisley to infiltrate the industry, and many Spitalfields-based manufacturers took advantage of those features. You see in the records loads of people moving up here to set up factories or go into business with other people. So at this time, linen and silk were the main products of Paisley from the 1760s right through until the early 1780s. And records tell us that there were 2,000 looms producing linen and 4,800 which had been turned to the manufacture of silk gauze by 1781. So that's around 20 years' time. Next slide, please, Stephen. The new description of Paisley by William Carlyle, published in the Gentleman's Magazine of 1787, describes Paisley silks as showing display of taste and genius, adding, Paisley silk gauzes became the fashionable wear throughout all polite circles in Europe. The Spitalfields manufacturers were fairly outdone. These are strong statements, but ones which were certainly replicated by market demand across Europe. It is important to note that woven silk should be labelled and sold at both home and international markets as English or British gauze, rather than being identified specifically as Scottish. This, as with the far-reaching international nature of the fashion for silk gauze, means it's difficult to definitively say whether any of the very few surviving examples were actually made in Paisley itself. And additionally, very few examples survive due to the delicacy of silk gauze. Therefore, to illustrate this slide and the last, we've just got a few images of garments and samples of silk gauze from the late 18th and early 19th century, which are manufactured in France and Great Britain. And they demonstrate the qualities of the fabric, so you can see its sheerness, lightness, delicacy, and the variation of the types of garments made. So this is obviously later 18th century, you've got a bodice, and then very early 19th century, you're moving towards really light dresses in the Empire line, so you've got the different cuts and worn over a light cotton as well. Paisley silk gauze manufacturing trade grew quickly, and this section of Paisley's textile economy accounted for different qualities of the fabric itself. It was expensive to buy in most cases, though both fashion and mass markets were relatively catered towards by different products, from full gowns, like you see here, to cheaper hair ribbons and everything in between. Silk gauze was difficult to care for, losing its shine and workability with washing, therefore it couldn't be resold on the second-hand market. And that's one factor in why it kind of demised quite a bit. Silk gauze allowed Paisley's weavers to compete in creation, cementing their social position as one of respectability gained through skill as a designer and maker of the product. Next slide, please, Stephen. As with all fashions, silk would endure its downfall. Its expense as a raw material and finished products, alongside how difficult it was to care for as a fabric, coincided with the new product of the town's manufacture. In addition, war and conflict impacted Paisley's silk trade, and the town's seeming focus upon one product alone would be detrimental. The market for expensive luxuries, including textiles, faced a serious decline. However, the skill and adaptability of Paisley's weavers would enable them to adopt another product. Muslin. Far less complex to weave, much less expensive to create itself, from processing and production through to taxation and consumption. Began to be produced in Paisley in 1785, in what appears now to be perfect timing for Paisley's weavers. Muslin is a very lightweight cotton, and we've got a few examples here today, which could be beautifully embellished with embroidery or decorated in a pattern in the weave itself at this time. Another import, muslin was originally made in India, but began to be made across Renfrewshire as well as Lanarkshire and Lancashire, with fashion turning towards the favour for finely woven and lightweight dresses, with cotton being most sought after, therefore driving the imitation of muslin in home production. Despite the continued profitability of silk, the state of Paisley's weaving trade at the turn of the 19th century is encapsulated again by William Carlyle, who wrote an article in 1806 for the Scots magazine and Edinburgh Literary Miscellany, which states that in 1805, so the year before that article was published, Paisley was producing an annual turnover of £100 per loom of muslin, to which there were 6,750 looms engaged, each worked by 3 operatives. Comparatively, there were now only 120 looms producing silk gauze in the town, each worked by 2 operatives, producing £80 per year per loom. Muslin quickly became the staple product of Paisley, as you can see from those statistics. And though silk gauzes were still fetching high prices, consumer demand for the product had fallen, so much that there was not enough of a market for the silk trade to continue in Paisley as it once had. However, as we have seen through our journey in Paisley's textile past thus far, another fashion would once again take over Paisley's looms. Next slide, please, Stuart. The garment for which Paisley is probably most well recognised is the textile which became its very own namesake, the Paisley shawl, which is imbued further with history of adoption and adaptation. Formerly known as the pine pattern shawl in the 18th and 19th century Western society, the Paisley shawl only became associated with this epithet around the mid-19th century, after Paisley overtook its early competitors in textile production of this kind. The fine cashmere shawl, originally imported from India in the late 18th century, landed in Britain and France, creating an immediate fashion explosion for the garment from the 1770s, which would soon become copied in European centres in around the early 1780s. Lyon in France, Norwich in England, and Edinburgh here in Scotland began producing shawls in imitation of cashmere originals. But they were made from sheep's wool rather than goat's hair as in the original, and appeared somewhat different to cashmere shawls. Pine pattern shawls at this time were highly admired in fashionable circles, and Indian imports could fetch high prices. However, as the fashion spread, manufacturers in Europe became unable to keep up with demand of imitation. It is said that one manufacturer, named Patterson, approached Paisley's weavers in 1805 for assistance with orders. Known for their ingenuity and adaptability, as we've seen, the introduction of the shawl to Paisley's weavers' looms would cement its place in the town's textile history. And this entry into the textile history of Paisley could not have come at a better time, falling fold in the trade in silk and muslin around the 1810s and 1820s. In 1812, there were only around 12 looms still remaining manufacturing silk here, whereas at this time in 1812, only 7 years since its introduction to Paisley, 100 looms had already been turned to pine pattern shawl manufacture. Cheaper pricing, good transport links to Glasgow and further to London and Paris fashion markets encouraged even more manufacturers to seek products from Paisley or move their own production to the town. Building on early moves by those involved in silk and muslin trades in the 18th century. Again, because Paisley's costs were cheaper for both living and production, as a result, Paisley shawls could be sold at much lower prices than cashmere originals and imitations produced in other centres as well. Cashmere-made shawls are reported to be priced up to £100, considerably substantial sum, whereas Paisley imitations will fetch as little as 10 guineas, which is £1 1 shilling in 1818. So quite a vast difference. As the shawl industry expanded in Paisley, so too would the trade itself. Where Paisley's weaver was formerly a relatively independently working practitioner, the trade became more diversified. Subsidiary trades broke down the process of shawl production, which now commanded several specialist workers to be involved. Where the weaver had once worked independently as designer, creator and seller of the shawl, utilising the assistance of a draw boy or girl who was a young child deemed necessary to aid the weaver in keeping track of their patterns while on the loom. There was also possibly an apprentice. From that, there increasingly became more people involved in shawl production, and the total grew to around 11 in number. Flower lashers, warpers and pern winders, dyers, winders and warpers, cutters, sewers, fringers, washers, pickers and dressers. The skills of each involved, however, were very artisanal, so they were definitely important to the trade. Using the expertise of other trades related to textile manufacture, the town shawls could be produced on an even larger scale and at even lower prices, selling to both fashion and mass markets. Ultimately, this gave Paisley the ability to overtake competitors in Edinburgh, Norwich and Lyon, thus resulting in the adoption of the shawl as the main product of Paisley, and the shawl becoming known as the Paisley shawl. Going back a few years, interestingly, by 1830, the sale of Paisley-produced shawls had reached £1 million in exports of the finest shawls destined for international fashion markets. So obviously, £1 million at that time is a fair bit of money. The breakdown of the shawl manufacturing process, however, resulted in a reduction in wages for the weaver. At the beginning of the shawl trade, coming to Paisley, a weaver would typically earn around £200 in a year. Conversely, the weaver's wage had reduced drastically to 2 shillings and sixpence in 1842, so quite a vast difference. And I've popped a few pictures on there just to show you the difference in the types of shawls that were being made in different places. So this first one is a photograph from France, and you can see the type that it's kind of like quite a dense pattern when you compare it to other ones. The second one, I think, is possibly an Edinburgh shawl. Can't definitively say though, apparently it's really difficult to tell. I've never seen one before, so would love to see one. And the last one, I think I brought it today so you can have a closer look, is a printed shawl that was made in Paisley. If you could go to the next slide, Stephen, thank you. Beautiful. The expansion of the shawl manufacturing industry, while reducing wages, heightened the reach of the shawl market from the middle of the 19th century, opening up to a larger range of prospective buyers. So we're on to conspicuous consumption again. The middle classes had their demands met by a wider use of the jacquard loom, which was used more widely in Britain from around the 1840s. This large loom, owned by a manager now and worked by a weaver, utilised a series of punch cards to create the shawl's decorative patterns, doing away with the need for a draw boy, and meaning the weaver could alone focus solely on making shawls to a set number. Use of the jacquard loom increased Paisley shawl output tenfold and shows us where the shawl industry can be seen to have transformed and where the weaver's independent status was finally ended. As with all its products, so too the shawl was affected by fashion. Enduring several trade fluctuations in its lifetime, though saved on one occasion by the purchase of 17 shawls by Queen Victoria in 1843, the shawl eventually ended its time in fashion in the 1870s, changing shapes, the crinoline underskirt transforming into the bustle, and the transitional nature of appropriate coverings to wear with such a skirt, as well as the adoption of the shawl by the lower classes through printing, expanding onto cheaper cottons, meant that pine pattern shawls in their huge original rectangular and square forms were no longer fashionable staple they once had been. However, the shawl, as we... I think that's me, sorry. However, the shawl endured, as will be discussed soon. Interestingly, the crossover of materials used in making shawls quite literally illustrates the range of different textiles made in Paisley. From woven wool, silk and muslin, they were printed with pine patterns and cheaper cottons also printed, demonstrate the diversity of Paisley's textile manufacture in this one product alone, as again we'll see when we look at some of the objects. Next slide, please, Stephen. Much of history oftentimes lays unrecorded due to the nature of past documenting of events. Class, gender, race and ethnicity are all immeasurably important factors to explore within historical research. Recognition of the underrepresented areas of society who are key contributors to various industries progresses our understanding of the past and gives rightful recognition to the contributors of individuals and groups to our history. Textile manufacture is no different. There are several textile products whose histories in connection to Paisley have somewhat been lost to time, though we're starting to bring them back out now. And one area of Paisley's contribution was embroidery, namely tambour and whitework. Fine, light textiles made up into garments, accessories and fancy goods were immensely popular through the late 18th and 19th centuries, and embroidery was applied to these fabrics to add decoration. Such embroidery became more commonly associated with Ayrshire. However, these two areas of textile production were huge within Paisley. And I'm not sure if you can see from here, but this image is beautiful, and we've got some tambour work just applied to the centre of the bodice on that gown there. Next slide, please, Stephen. Both tambour and whitework held an important place within the west of Scotland's textile industries, from processing and production of fabric to the application of embroidery which adorned it. Such embroidery would be added to garments, bodices, skirts, pelerines, collars, and also textiles used around the home. Embroidery was considered at this time an appropriate creative pastime for women, as it could be undertaken in the sphere of domesticity. However, as the fashion for such decorated fabrics grew, the number of employed in production being paid to make such articles increased dramatically. Practitioners of both tambour and whitework were skilled artisans working from home or collectively in production sites. As the demand for such goods grew further, the industry took on a mass manufacturing scale throughout the 19th century, growing to incorporate a number of different types of products. Lightweight cottons, namely muslin and fine silks, were most popular for tambour work, displaying the versatility of the simple chain tambour stitches which depicted floral motifs and trailing forms in cotton, silks and even silver gilt threads, with the inclusion of beads and sequins adding further detail. As the beginning of the 19th century progressed, the extreme widening of the sleeves throughout the 1820s and into the 1830s meant that lappets and pelerines grew in popularity, making good use of emerging whitework industry, as you can see here, which is one of my favourite images I think ever. Also known as sewed muslin, what differentiated whitework from other embroidery techniques such as tambour were the types of stitches used, namely satin stitch, which surrounded needlepoint lace inserts of floral forms in white cotton. Whitework, though the height of fashion, was also cheaper than tambour, using simple white cottons and silks rather than the fancier threads. Between 1830 and 1833, the extraordinarily large gigot or leg of mutton sleeve reached its greatest form. Pelerines, which were extremely delicate accessories, often made from whitework muslin, sat on the shoulder and draped the front and back of the bodice, emphasising the gigot sleeve even further. Such styling was accompanied by highly decorated bonnets as well as Paisley shawls. So you can see here, this is a pelerine, and you can see the size of that accessory alone is pretty huge on top of these sleeves, which are massive as well. And the dress would have just shown the feet as well, so the myth we have about showing ankles back in the day, put it in the bin. Along with pelerines, the century progressed. Whitework adorned collars, cuffs and caps, along with robes and bonnets for babies. Again, we've got some of those today. But as with all textiles we've examined so far, fashion once again played a huge part in the demise of such decorative embroidery techniques being produced in Paisley. A flooded market and the impacts this had on desirability amongst the fashionable elite, technological change and the impacts of mass production techniques, along with changing silhouettes in dress, are all key factors to consider as influences on the need for trades to turn their production to more profitable items. Next slide, please, Stephen. So we're going back to the muslin dress that you might remember from a few slides back. Looking more closely at this muslin dress, which was manufactured by Brown, Sharp & Co. of Paisley circa 1800s, it can be seen that the garment is woven with a geometric design and also features whitework embroidery. It's quite difficult to see, but if you wanted to look on the screen at the end of the presentation, you can really see the details there. And this one's held by Glasgow Museums, and it's just a fabulous surviving piece that was made in Paisley at that time. Where finer examples of muslin garments were often decorated with tambour embroidery, conversely, the woven pattern incorporated to the fabric of this dress, along with the whitework embroidery added to it, shows this was a cheaper garment, though still expensive, compared to those which would have been a plain weave and had decoration applied later exclusively with the more expensive tambour work. Next slide, please, Stephen. So here concludes our journey through just some of the areas of the 18th and 19th century textile economies of Paisley. A defining feature of our exploration into fabric and finished garment production, dress and society through this time is fashion. Dress and fashion, though appearing as frivolous pursuits, tell us much about society, culture, economics, politics and technologies. Material cultures imbued within dress, where time is captured within the fabric of clothes. Tangibly linked to these garments themselves is change. What was happening in the world is exemplified within the clothing which was worn at that time. Market forces, fashions for goods for all kind, discoveries and developments were key to Paisley's textile industry and economies. Those making and selling textile goods in the town were exposed to the fashion market, a platform which could itself most certainly be defined as frivolous, in that its changeable nature could impact an industry immeasurably. The uniqueness of Paisley's weavers, dyers, sewers, artisans of subsidiary trades, and all areas of textile and garment manufacture in the town was that they were adaptable, able to produce a range of textile goods as the market demanded, due to their skill, knowledge, pricing, and geographic location. This was particularly evident through the 18th and into the 19th century. Paisley was adept at altering their production to meet market demand. The level of output, different textile goods conjures images of what manufactories, bleach fields, dye works, warehouse stores and retailers would have made up Paisley's textile centre, streets certainly lined with fabrics of all kinds. With different textiles being produced concurrently, some overtook others in levels of manufacturing output, and eventually many ceased production here altogether, most evidently towards the latter part of the 19th century. Despite this, there was a fashionable endurance for many of these products. Some fabrics and finished garments came and went, and others held their place in fashionable and everyday dress even to this day. This endurance came in many forms, including repurposing and recycling, which most commonly found in the Paisley shawl, which was quite often transformed into other garments including mantles, dolman, capes, coats, dressing gowns and even handbags in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's been thoroughly enjoyable and important to explore the history of Paisley's textile economies with you today and bring Paisley's long-forgotten, internationally acclaimed fabrics and finished garments to the fore once more. The significant place where Paisley's products held on home and overseas markets meant that the town was recognised the world over and its textile designed in fashionable circles. Paisley's status as a world-renowned maker of quality materials must not be forgotten, and the variety with which those involved in the various textile trades were able to contribute should certainly once more be highlighted, and continued celebration of dress and textile history. There is one more little slide at the end as well, Stephen. So now let's go look at some bits and pieces. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm sure you'll agree we've had two excellent talks this afternoon. I think both speakers would be quite happy to take a couple of questions just now, if anybody has any questions to ask.
Yeah.
Sorry, will I just repeat that question? Just
Yeah.
so one of the slides referred to silklish, and we're just asking, can we identify what silklish actually was?
Was that on the little image of the...
I think it was Stephen
Oh,
actually.
okay, yeah. Sorry, crossover and textiles. I'm not entirely sure. Suzanne, would you know? There's a few textile historians in the room. No. No. I'm going to write that down and take your email address and I will find out for you.
Thank you for the question anyway. It's good to see that even the experts have to think about things as well. Anybody else got anything they want to ask? Suzanne?
Obviously, in your PhD,
Mhm.
you're sort of looking at the subject of utility wear.
Yeah.
But do you think at any point you may go back to looking in more detail at any of the particular aspects of what you talked about, or do you think where you are with that is where you've reached, or would you like to do more research on it?
I would love to do more. I signed a contract, so I can tell you. I'm writing a chapter for Bloomsbury Encyclopedia of World Textiles just now about Paisley textile production in the 18th and 19th century. So definitely going to be delving even further. That was kind of, a bit of a whistle-stop tour. But I think, living in Paisley for as long as I did, I absolutely fascinated by the textile history here. And the comparisons with Yorkshire is very interesting because they were very much staples, a lot of the products that they were manufacturing there, whereas here it was very changeable. They had staples, but there was a lot of fluctuation and they turned over to different things. So I would definitely love to find out more.
And out of those, obviously, the Paisley shawls and sales had a lot of in-depth research over the years. But out of the other products and manufacturers, which do you think you'd be most sort of drawn to?
I think silk, because it's so underexplored, but it was the first internationally famed product of Paisley. It's where Paisley got its status, and then shawls brought that back kind of thing. So silk definitely, especially because it's so fine and there's not much survives. There's some sample books in Paisley Museum collection, and the V&A in Dundee and the Scottish Galleries, there's one on display, so if you end up in Dundee, definitely go and see that. But I think definitely silk. I find it fascinating. Thank you.
Is any of the raw material which produced the linen, for instance, grown locally?
I can answer for shawls. They tried to do the cashmere goat's hair here, and that didn't work. That's why they ended up using sheep's wool. Other than that, imports definitely for silk. Yes, for that I know. Stephen might know more about linen.
The linen was all grown locally. It started Clancy needed it. It started growing it locally.
Fascinating comparison in materials, really. That
You talked about some of the activities of the weaving and embroidery being acceptable as domestic, and therefore sort of flourished because it's accessible. In terms of the designs, was there like separate design houses that then went to the manufacturer, or were the two combined? Who came up with the design?
So for the embroidery, there was a big bleaching and printing industry. So when it turned from the kind of the cottage to mass production, you would get things like collars with prints already on them, which you then applied the embroidery. So that was done out of house, and then you would get that product in as an embroiderer. Shawls, it did start out as weavers, and then increasingly it was designers, especially after jacquard looms, because you would get the punched cards and that would have the design already cut out. So it's sort of like pins that drop down and do the pattern. So once the museum opens, I would definitely, Paisley Museum, once it reopens, I would definitely go up there and see a jacquard loom, because then you can kind of connect to how it works if you haven't seen one before. It's absolutely fascinating because it was the first computerised system, really. So yeah, series of punch cards, and it would be a designer that would do that. A good place to look for that is the V&A's collection search. If you just type in Paisley shawls, there was a designer called George Hates that did a lot around the 1850s, and you can see it all on point paper. Yeah, so external designers from that point for that as well. Thank you. Mainly shawls. I've not seen anything about other types of fabric. Possibly other production centres might have done things like that, but it would have been a finished shawl itself that was produced here, yeah.
Right, well, thank you all for coming, and thank you both Stephen and Lucy for such entertaining and interesting talks that I'm sure a lot of us found a lot of fresh information that they didn't know about before. Nice to see Stephen's coming, fairly up-to-date research, and Lucy with her exceptional knowledge of the shawls here. So I would like you to give them both a round of applause. Thank you. And as Lucy says, a wee chance of having some hands-on stuff. Thank you.